said he had reason to believe there was a body in the house. Brady was on the divan bed in the living room in his undervest, writing a note to explain why he was not going to work that day. Upstairs, the police demanded to see in a locked room. When Myra said the key was at work, a policeman offered to go and fetch it. At this, Brady said, "You'd better tell them. There was a row here last night. It's in there. Under the window in the bedroom, there was a plastic wrap bundle." In a letter to me, it described how when the police came in and told him to dress, he had cautiously felt under the settee, where he kept the loaded gun. He had made up his mind to shoot the policeman then himself, but it was not there. Then he remembered the previous evening, as they had been carrying the body upstairs. The revolver in its shoulder holster had been banging against his ribs, and he had taken it out and left it upstairs. Myra was not arrested at the same time as Brady. The police probably accepted that Evans had been killed in the course of a quarrel, and Brady's bad limp due to a kick on the shin from Evans seemed to support this. So for the next 5 days, Myra remained free, going to see Brady every day. But David Smith told the police that Brady had stored 2 suitcases in the left luggage at Manchester Central Station, and these were recovered. The cloakroom ticket was later found where Brady described it in the spine of a prayer book. These proved to contain pornographic photographs, including 9 of Leslie Ann Downey, photographs of Ian and Myra on the moors, the tape of Leslie Ann pleading to be allowed to leave, various books on sex and torture, and wigs, coches and notes on robbing banks. The police decided to dig on the moors using the photographs as a guide, and the bodies of Leslie Ann Downey and John Kilbride were recovered. On May the 6th, 1966, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley were both sentenced to life imprisonment. Only the abolition of the death penalty a month after their arrest saved them from the hangman. There had been no confession. At the trial, Brady maintained that Leslie had been brought to the house by 2 men who had taken her away after taking photographs. Myra was sent to Holloway, Brady to Durham, where he opted for solitary confinement and studied German. He and Myra wrote constantly, and he began a campaign to try to secure her visiting rights, insisting that they were in effect man and wife. When this came to nothing, he went on hunger strike, but although Myra had his photograph on her cell wall, she was embarking on a lesbian affair with a teenager called Rita. It was the first of many. She was gradually drawing apart from Ian, who was irritated to learn that she was in the process of returning to Catholicism. Here the Catholic peer Lord Longford seems to have been instrumental. Fred Harrison has an interesting anecdote. In 1967, a child killer named Raymond Morris was sent to Durham. He had been murdered and raped 3 little girls, aged 5, 6 and 7. Brady loathed him. On one occasion he threw boiling tea in his face, for which he received 28 days confined to his cell, and subsequently punched him in the face as he was walking upstairs, knocking him down again. Brady told Harrison years later, "I realised that, in a way, I was attacking myself." Mrs. Weston, mother of Keith Bennett. Although I have never been given, I have not been able to bring myself to read them. I have been afraid to read them. Understand, I have to keep mental blocks tightly shut and keep control. The authorities have refused Mrs. West's request to visit me. I can't say how it would have worked out if the meeting had taken place. Remorse for my part in this was with Brady on July the 1st, 1987, when Pauline Reed's body was finally located. It was lying on its side, fully clothed, and the throat had been cut. The clothes had obviously been pushed up, then carelessly pulled down. The following day, Brady agreed to go on the moor and try and find the body of Keith Bennett. On July the 3rd, Brady was allowed back onto the moor, the first time in 22 years, but by mid-afternoon he had lost his bearings. The moor had changed a great deal since the 1960s. By that time, so many reporters and news camera were following that Top had decided to call it a day, and although Brady offered to go back to the moor to try again, the Home Office refused to allow it. During many visits to Park Lane, Toppin and Brady talked a great deal about the typography of the moor, but Brady would not discuss the murder themselves, except to say that Myra's accounts were thoroughly untrustworthy. During one of these conversations, Brady talked about other murders, as he had in fact with Fred Harrison. He claimed that in Glasgow he had seen a man mistreating an old woman and had followed him and stabbed him with a sheath knife. Near Manchester Station, he had quarrelled with a man on a piece of waste ground and bricked him, leaving him on the ground. Again in Manchester, after getting into an argument with a woman, he picked her up and threw her over the parapet wall into the canal. He told Toppin that the body of a youth he had killed was buried near one of the markers on the A635, but declined to elaborate. I have no idea whether these murders actually happened, although something he had said in one of his letters to me inclines me to think not. After Toppin's book came out in 1989, Ian was indignant that he had, while still a serving officer, been allowed to publish his account of the Moors investigation, when the police, like the armed forces and the civil service, have to sign a confidentiality agreement. Brady's protest led to the book being withdrawn. During our early exchanges of letters, Ian would put two parallel red lines across every page with the words personal and confidential, not for publication. Finally, as he came to trust me, he stopped bothering to do it. His letters often contained personal anecdotes that throw an interesting light on his personality, like the following, dated December the 12th, 1992. Another absurd insight. I always liked the best seats in the cinema, but when there was a full house and we had to queue, and the doorman would come walking along the queue declaring that two of the best seats, also the most expensive, were available, I hated having to walk past the queue in order to accept them. I felt that I was deliberately snubbing or insulting them by my action. I can afford the most expensive, you can't. Not very flattering to my demon image, but I can laugh at such paradoxes. Now, to even the account, I'll give you the other side of the coin. In Inside the Mind of a Murderer, Myra refers to a true crime incident. We had come out of a cinema and gone for a late night drink in the town centre bar in Manchester. As we were drinking, a group of 5 or 6 men came in together and sat at right angles to us. The one nearest kept staring at Myra with a stupid grin on his face. I gave him a few warning glances, but he continued. I fumed silently for some minutes, and then suddenly I took a decision, and the black light began to operate. Casually, I slipped my hand into my overcoat pocket, and with thumb and forefinger opened the long back knife I always carried, made entirely of stainless steel, devoid of ornament, and with the functional purity of scalpel. I glanced at the bottles on the table in front of me, selecting which ones to choose as additional weapons. I felt marvellous, delighted, and ready to hack the half-wits. I turned towards them. Who the fuck are you staring at? You looking for trouble? Words to that effect. I waited for the first move, and intended to deal with the starer first. His grin had disappeared, and his mouth hung slack in a white face. His mouth gave me the idea of sticking the knife into it and expanding the sliced grin up to his ear. During all this, I hadn't said a word to Myra. My hand was still in my